Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the last event in our RiverWatch Fall Speaker Series. For those of you who are new to the Illinois RiverWatch Network, RiverWatch is a citizen science organization that trains volunteers to monitor water quality in their own communities. The mission of RiverWatch is to safeguard the future of Illinois rivers and streams through stewardship, education, and sound science. Before we get started, I ask that you keep your microphone muted during the presentation to limit the distractions. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation. If you have a question you would like to ask, you can either put it in the chat box and Danelle can answer at the end of her talk, or you can save it and ask it aloud during the Q&A session. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Danelle Haake, a stream ecologist and the RiverWatch director with us at National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. Danelle earned her PhD from St. Louis University. Her research there focused on the impact of road salt and on aquatic invertebrates, inspired by her work as a citizen scientist. Today, she will be talking about those impacts and how the negative side effects can be mitigated. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Danelle Haake.
Hello. All right. Hello, and thank you for the introduction, Hannah, and thank all of you for being here with me this evening. Let me get this where it needs to be. All right. So I want to start out with my computer functioning how I set it up to work with. Just a second. Technical difficulty. Restart that slideshow. All right. Okay, so I'd like to start off with a little bit of a story. So this is a story of an ecologist whose job was to restore prairie and forest ecosystems so that students would have a chance to imagine what their neighborhoods may have looked like about 300 years ago. So before Europeans settled in the region. So the place where this ecologist worked also had a stream flowing through it. And so she worked with some volunteers who had been trained in how to measure water quality. And so they took samples together every month in this stream. And they took these samples to track how things were changing in the little stream and to keep an eye out for any problems. Well, one cold winter morning, the volunteers and the ecologist hiked the half-mile through the prairie and then through the forest so that they could get to their site along the stream. The going was a bit more difficult than normal because it had snowed the week before, and there were several icy patches along the trail. When they finally got to the stream, they collected their samples and took their measurements, and everything was looking pretty normal until they got to the last measurement of the day, chloride. Now, usually chloride in their little stream was around 60 milligrams per liter, maybe 80. This time, the reading was off the chart, literally. Their test could measure concentrations up to 600 milligrams per liter, and this was higher than that. They ran it again, just in case there was some sort of error in the test, but the readings were the same. It was beyond what that test could read. So just so happened that they had a second test available, and so they tried that one, and that one could go all the way up into the thousands. And so they found out that the chloride in their stream was over 3,000, so much higher than normal. It only took them a few moments before one of them realized what was going on. They had all seen the salt trucks clearing the roads just the day before. They'd been glad to see the trucks because it meant that the roads would be clear enough that they could go out to do their water sampling. But what they hadn't thought about was the fact that the salt from those trucks was going to end up in their lovely little stream. So the ecologist and the volunteers chatted about road salt and water quality all the way back through the forest and the prairie. They emailed each other, and they emailed other volunteers who monitored water quality in different streams, trying to figure out just how far this problem reached. What they found is that this is a big problem. They contacted the local stormwater officials, they contacted staff with state government agencies to see what they could do. How can they help their stream? So the use of road salt to improve the safety of travel following winter snow and ice is a relatively recent phenomenon. This has only been going on since the 1940s. Since that time, this practice has gradually spread into most parts of the world where snow falls. The use of salt in the United States now exceeds 20 million tons per winter. So the purchase price of this salt for cities that buy it in bulk is about $50 per ton. So that means that we're making, across the United States, an annual investment of $1 billion towards safe transportation. But there are several negative consequences to using road salt. First off, salt is corrosive to concrete and to metal. It has been estimated that 1 ton of salt, that ton that costs about $50, can do about $600 in damage to infrastructure. So that means that we're causing about 12 billion with a B, $12 billion in damage to roads and bridges across the United States every year. So this doesn't include any damage that's done to motor vehicles or other infrastructure. This is just the damage being done to roads and bridges. So we put this salt down on the concrete, sidewalks, parking lots, roads, and that salt dissolves as the snow melts. So the salty water can travel from those paved surfaces into areas that have vegetation. Salt at these concentrated levels is toxic to many plants, including grass and street trees. And this toxicity is also of concern in places where plant-based stormwater solutions like rain gardens and bioswales have been used. So this is doing a lot of damage to our plants. But then that salty water runs off the pavement or through the grass into storm drains. And these storm drains transport the salty runoff into nearby streams. So in our region, and in this part of the country, we have freshwater streams. And so all of the animals that live here have adapted to freshwater conditions. But every winter, our aquatic life is exposed to highly concentrated salt from runoff, potentially creating toxic conditions. But the salt doesn't just end up in the streams. It may migrate into groundwater or accumulate in lakes. Both surface water and groundwater serve as drinking water supplies. And so the increase of salt in these areas raises concerns about drinking water safety, especially for those of us who have underlying health conditions like heart disease. So that's just a little bit of background on why our current use of road salt is of great concern to many people. Now, before we get back to the story, I do want to give a little bit of context about chloride in aquatic ecosystems. So natural chloride concentrations for streams are generally less than 40 milligrams per liter. So there's already a little bit more chloride in that stream in our story than there would be in a natural stream, because in our story it was 60 to 80. Now there are also exceptions to this based on the geology of the area. In some places there's just a lot more salt in the landscape, and so it does end up in the streams. But for the most part, 40 milligrams per liter is a safe bet. Now in many parts of the United States, water quality standards have a listing for how much chloride is safe to have in our natural water systems. And in most states, those values range between 230 and 860 milligrams per liter. And then as a point of reference for the high end, seawater contains about 20,000 milligrams of chloride per liter of water. All right, so I mentioned that the ecologist and the volunteers had asked their fellow volunteers to check out their own streams. So this turned into a long-term citizen science monitoring project that has been ongoing for the past 8 years. The samples collected for this graph were collected by 36 trained volunteers with the Missouri Stream Team program who have been monitoring chloride in the winter at 65 sites across the St. Louis area. They've collected nearly 3,000 grab samples since they started in 2012. Now on this map, we see a summary of the maximum chloride concentrations that were found at all of these sites. So over here, we have the city of St. Louis. So there's the most urbanized, most dense population in the area. And then there's decreasing urbanization as we move to the west. So these sites that are in blue, just in the darker blue color, those meet all of the water quality standards. And the light blue sites meet some of the standards. So it's kind of in that range between 230 and 860. All of the sites in yellow, orange, and red had maximum concentrations of chloride that are higher than what the water quality standards say is acceptable. So we can see that as we move away from downtown, there are fewer sites that have high maximum chloride concentrations. So we have a lot more blue to the west, and a lot more red, orange, and yellow here to the east. Now the size of the dot is related to the size of the watershed draining to that sampling point. So we can see here that there really isn't necessarily a relationship between the size of the watershed and the amount of chloride that's being found. What is related to the amount of chloride is the amount of urban area, and more specifically, the amount of roads and parking lots. Now, all of this data was collected by volunteers who physically went to a stream, they took out some water, and they ran a test on that sample of water. And this is called a grab sample, and the information that it gives us is a snapshot of a point in both time and space. So with this information, we can't really make any assumptions on what the chloride concentration would have been a couple of days before or a few days later based on that one sample. So these are the highest concentrations that the volunteers measured, but they are most likely not the highest concentrations that occurred in these locations. So for that reason, I like to say that we have to take these grab samples with a grain of salt. Okay, I know it's a bad joke, but I'm hoping that I at least woke up one or two of you with that. All right, so because they knew that they could only get so much information from these snapshots of the grab samples, the ecologist and the volunteers thought it would be good to get some more detailed information. The ecologist picked 15 of the sites that had been monitored by the volunteers, including some of the sites that were in blue, some that were in yellow and orange, and definitely a few that were in red. So she got some data loggers and she put them in the streams for 2 winters to end up with measurements of chloride every 15 minutes for those 2 winters. And so this chart shows what she found. So the shaded yellow bar near the bottom doesn't really show up very well for some reason on my screen. The shaded yellow bar is that range of water quality standards, of 230 to 860 milligrams per liter. Now I zoomed in on this one so we can kind of see a little more clearly. Again, here's that yellow bar. And then the dashed thin lines represent the full range of the data that was collected over those 2 winters. So this is the maximum up here. This is the minimum value that was found down here. These boxes represent the middle half of the data. So a quarter of the data are above the box and a quarter of the data are below the box. And then this horizontal black bar in the middle is the median. So that means that half of the collected data are above there and the other half are below there. Excuse me. So as the ecologist looked at this data, she noticed that only 3 of the sites never went above the bar representing the water quality standards. 1, 2, and 3 over here. So, these 3 sites were sites that were further to the west in the places where there was minimal urban development. Now, on the other end of things, several of the sites had maximum chloride concentrations approaching 8,000. Now, this happens to be the same as the highest concentration that one of the volunteers had found several years earlier, but in the volunteer measurements, only the 4 highest measurements out of almost 3,000 data points had a concentration higher than 4,000. So we've got a lot more data over 4,000 milligrams per liter with this data logger data than we did with the volunteers. Now with the data collected from data loggers, they learned that one site even had chloride concentrations over 25,000. So this is well over the concentration that would be found in the ocean. So there's clearly a problem with high chloride in many of the streams in the St. Louis area. Now, knowing that there's a problem is a very important step in fixing a problem, but it's also important to understand why it's a problem. And I've already mentioned the 4 key problems of road salt: corrosion, toxicity to plants, toxicity to freshwater animals, and threats to drinking water supplies. Well, our ecologists and volunteers wanted to understand a bit more specifically what this means to the animals living in their own local streams. So like the Illinois RiverWatch program that I work for now, volunteers with the Missouri Stream Team program are trained to look at aquatic invertebrates in order to measure the biological side of water quality. Aquatic invertebrates are used as indicators based on their tolerance of pollution. So for the Missouri Stream Team program, organisms are broken into 3 groups. Sensitive animals like stoneflies and caddisflies, somewhat tolerant organisms like down here and on the top of the second page, like dragonflies and crayfish, and then very tolerant animals like worms and midgeflies. So by identifying the kinds of animals that are in a stream, volunteers are able to determine a water quality rating for their sample. Now, as an example, if they find 3 kinds of sensitive animals, each of those are worth 3 points for a total of 9. If they've also found 1 somewhat tolerant animal, that's worth 2 points. And if there's also 3 types of tolerant animals worth 1 point each, that's worth 3 total. So if we have 9 plus 2 plus 3, that gives us a water quality rating of 14. So many of the volunteers who had been measuring chloride in the winter have also been looking at invertebrates in that same location. So the ecologist and 3 of the volunteers set out to use the invertebrate data along with the chloride data to get a better understanding of the local impacts of road salt. So the team is still working on this project, but I can show you some of the early results of their work. These graphs show how water quality ratings differ among sites based on the maximum chloride concentration in the volunteer data set, and then the average of all chloride measurements by volunteers made at that site. So this is with the maximum, and this is with the average of the chloride. So the black lines show what's called the mean regression. So this is a line that you would usually see when you're looking for a trend in a data set. So it shows, for example, that if your maximum chloride concentration that you expect in your stream is 4,000, on average, you would expect, you go up to the line and then bring that over, you would expect to see a water quality rating of about 12. But there's a lot of scatter in this data, and it looks like you could expect really a rating anywhere between 1 and 20. And so what the group chose to do is to look at something called quantile regression. And that's what this line here, the dashed blue line, shows. So instead of using the black line that shows you where the average is, the blue line shows where the 90th percentile is. And so that means that 90% of the data is going to be below the blue line and 10% would be above. Now, using the 90th percentile regression line shows us more closely what water quality rating we can expect if other environmental factors are not limiting. And the reason that this is used is because we should expect variability in stream data. So for example, in places like this where chloride is low and it's not higher than any of the water quality standards, chloride shouldn't be a limiting factor for the ability of invertebrates to grow and thrive in that location. But just because the chloride is low does not mean that the invertebrates aren't being limited by something else. So maybe there's poor habitat at the site because there's erosion upstream that's filled in all of the gravel habitat with silt and sediment. Or maybe there was a fertilizer spill the week before the sample that killed a lot of the critters. Maybe there's not enough dissolved oxygen in the stream, and so sensitive animals are suffocating. So there's many things besides chloride that can limit a water quality rating like this. So by using the 90th percentile regression, it shows us more closely what water quality ratings we can expect if other environmental factors are not limiting. So if the maximum chloride concentration that we expect is 4,000 and there are no other limiting factors, we could expect, go up here, we could expect a water quality rating probably somewhere around 18. That sounds a little bit better than 12. But again, that's the difference between expecting other variables to impact your rating versus it just being, this is what chloride is going to do. So regardless of which of these sets of lines you prefer to look at, it is apparent that as chloride increases, as the chloride numbers go higher, the water quality rating does go down. So what can be done about this? You know, this is a big problem. How do we go about fixing such a big problem? Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret that I'm sure you haven't guessed. The ecologist in the story I've been telling is me. And the volunteers are several very dear friends of mine with the Missouri Stream Team program. Together, we learned and came up with a few things that each of us can do to use less salt. So the key to using less salt is to just not put so much on the pavement in the first place. For individuals, this means doing something else. For example, shovel the driveway and the sidewalk. It's good exercise. I know none of us want to do it, but it is good exercise. So if for some reason you can't do it, maybe get help from a family member or from a neighbor. You know, all of us say that the kids are spending too much time in front of computers, especially now with remote learning. Get them outside and shoveling those driveways. Now, some things don't shovel very well. You know, if you have a lot of ice and not a lot of snow, shoveling probably won't work well. So if this is a problem, you can put something else down that will help you gain traction, like sand. I've also heard of people using birdseed for this, but just make sure that you're not using like the birdseed that's those tiny little perfectly round beads, because I feel like that's probably going to be worse than just the ice alone. But when you find something that works for you, be sure to tell others. Let them know that this is going to protect the environment, it's going to protect their pavement, and it's going to protect their cars from corrosion. So there's a lot of upsides to doing something else. Now, as far as cities go, they have a lot of options, and those are called best management practices. These are things that they can do, like taking the temperature of the pavement so that they make sure that they're using the right amount of salt for the job. They also have mechanical spreaders, and a lot of these can vary the speed of the salt application based on the speed of the vehicle. So this way, every time they stop at a stop sign or a stoplight, they aren't just continuing to dump a whole bunch of extra salt in one place. Another technique that they're starting to use is called brining. Now, I'll get more into this in a minute. But once we got to a certain point in this citizen science road salt project, as Hannah mentioned at the beginning, I started to do a PhD. And working with people at St. Louis University, we looked at some road salt. So the last chunk of information I'm going to share with you today is based on the research that I did for my PhD. Okay, now you might have noticed that I've mentioned brine here. I've also got brine here in parentheses because it is something that you can do with like a little squirt bottle on your sidewalk. But so we've got brine in both of these, but hopefully that has you wondering, what is brine? Well, you may have thought about it as far as brining your turkey, because that's something people do. But for just the same as that, brine is just salt water. So the practice of brining involves taking the same solid rock salt that's normally used on roads, dissolving it in the water to create a 23% solution, and spraying it on the road before the storm. Now you may notice in these two pictures, this is just spreading the rock salt, and this is spreading brine on the road. One couple of things you might notice is that there's a lot of kind of dust and bounce here. There's some misting here, but it's going to end up on the road. Some of these are going to bounce pretty far off where they maybe don't belong. And also this is being done when the roads are wet and it's looking kind of maybe a little bit nasty outside. You get to spray this on the roads when it's a nice sunny day because it's before the storm hits. Okay, so there's several suggested economic and environmental benefits for brining. As I can kind of tell from this anti-ice liquid truck, that it can be done up to 2 days before a forecasted storm. So this allows road crews to work during regular business hours, and it cuts down on overtime costs because I'm not sure about where you live, but at least where I live, most of the storms come in the middle of the night. So the less they have to spend in the middle of the night putting salt on roads, the better for everyone, really. Now, according to various studies that have been conducted on interstate highways, the same road clearing effect can be achieved using half or less the amount of salt. And so this should reduce a lot of those negative consequences that I mentioned earlier. But there are potential drawbacks to the use of brine, especially in areas like St. Louis, where it's often very difficult to predict the form that a winter storm is going to take. A lot of times the storms will start as rain, but then transition into snow or ice. Under these circumstances, if brine has been applied before the storm, the rain is going to wash it off of the pavement before the snow hits. Now, if this happens, road crews will need to return to spread the rock salt as well. And so they will have used brine and rock salt, increasing the labor cost and the amount of salt that ends up in the environment. So there have been a few studies about the effectiveness of brining, mostly on highways and in parking lots, but none of them have included real-world applications of brine for storms in residential areas or the use of brining in multiple cities by multiple different public works groups. And so for this project, I studied residential areas in 3 pairs of cities. Each pair was selected to include one city that has a brining system, and those are the ones in dark blue, and then one city that does not have a brining system, and those are the ones in light blue. Pairs were set up as neighboring cities to control as much as possible for the variability of storms as they cross the region. Sometimes a storm that drops 1 inch in one area will drop 3 or 4 inches in another. Pairs were also selected to try to minimize the socioeconomic differences between the cities. So 4 locations within each city were chosen. These sites were selected to exclude areas that had commercial or industrial development, because those are places where private application on parking lots might really skew the results. So for 2 winters, data loggers were used to record conductivity and pressure at 5-minute intervals in the 4 stormwater pipes in each of those cities. So these measurements were used along with the dimensions of the pipe in order to estimate the chloride load at each 5-minute time point, and then the chloride yield for 9 storm events that occurred over those 2 winters. I also identified the watershed for each pipe and determined the area of road that was draining into each location. So this allowed me to evaluate the chloride yields for each storm as the grams of chloride, the amount of chloride per square meter of road. Now, before I present the results, I want to guide you through what you're going to see. On both of these axes, I'm displaying the yield of salt for a storm event measured in grams per square meter of road. On the x-axis is the salt from the city that has a brining system, while on the y-axis is the salt used during the same event from the paired city that does not have brine. So every point that you're going to see on this figure represents one of those pairs of cities for one storm event. Any point that, whoops, that's the wrong direction. Any point that falls in this region above the 1-to-1 line represents a pair in which, for that storm, the city that uses only rock salt used more salt than the city that uses brine. A point on the 1-to-1 line is a storm for which both cities used the same amount of salt. And any point that's below the line represents a pair in which the brining city used more salt than the city that relies on rock salt alone. So this would be, as an example, if it rained first and they had used the brine and then they had to reapply salt. So as you can see from our results here, most of the points are above that 1-to-1 line. There's a significant linear relationship between the paired cities in their salt use, and this relationship is significantly above the 1-to-1 line. So simply put, on average, the cities that had the brining technology used 45% less salt. But what does a 45% salt reduction look like in the real world? Well, to find out, we're going to do a little visualization. Imagine a residential street about 7 meters wide. So this is a street in one of the areas that I was studying. Now we take this 7 meter wide street, but we just really want to think about a 1 meter stretch of that road. And then what we're going to do is spread one of these containers of salt. You can just buy them at the grocery store. Just sprinkle this over that stretch of road. But then you're going to do that 4 more times. This is the amount of salt that the brining cities did not use, that their neighbors that relied entirely on rock salt did put on their roads during the course of the 9 storms during 2 years. So this represents a savings of about 1.5 tons of salt per lane mile of road per year. Now, a lane mile of road is basically 1 mile length and 1 lane wide. So a mile long stretch of the road in the picture would actually be 2 lane miles. So basically each lane mile is a mile long pass with a truck, for example. All right, so 1.5 tons of salt per lane mile per year. Now, according to FHA data, in the state of Missouri, there are nearly 48,000 lane miles of urban roads that are classified as minor arterial, collector, and local streets. So the use of brining could cut salt use by 72,000 tons per year in the cities of Missouri. This is not looking at interstates or highways at all. It's just kind of the side streets. Now in Illinois, there are over 95,000 lane miles of urban roads. And so brining there would cut salt use by 140,000 tons per year. So if this saves that $50 per ton in the purchasing of the salt and $600 in damage done to infrastructure, that would be a grand total of $47 million per year on the urban streets of Missouri and $93 million per year in urban parts of Illinois. I consider that a pretty impressive savings. Now, a lot of things that save money and keep infrastructure in good condition tend to be bad for the environment. So let's just look at this from an environmental perspective too. All right, so if we get one of these little kiddie pools that you can find at your neighborhood big box store and fill it with about 8 inches of water, that's 100 gallons. But we're going to do that 7 more times. And then you're going to sprinkle your container of salt in these 8 tubs of water, just spread it evenly between them. With a concentration of 230 milligrams per liter, all of that water is now considered toxic to aquatic life. But remember, for this little stretch of road, we used 5 containers of salt. So we need 40 kiddie pools for this stretch of road. So about 4,000 gallons of water that's protected by using brine on this one short stretch of residential street from 9 storms over 2 winters. Now, if we put that back on a lane mile basis per year, that would be the equivalent of filling about 2.4 Olympic swimming pools or nearly 10 Washington monuments with water that is toxic to aquatic life every year from every lane mile of road. I hope you found this informative. I would be glad to take your questions, but before I do want to make sure to thank all of the people who've been a part of these projects. First, I have to thank the EPA Urban Waters Program and the PEO Fellowship for their financial support. Second, I could not have done the best management practice work without the support of the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District and the Public Works departments in Jennings, Ferguson, Rock Hill, Webster Groves, Baldwin, and Manchester. Definitely want to thank my field crew. And then finally, this work would not have happened without the hard work and inspiration of the Missouri Stream Team volunteers who really inspired all of this research, especially my Stream Team co-authors, Steve and Claire and Bob, who I'm having a lot of fun working with them. We're trying to put this work into a publication that can be shared broadly. So that, I would be glad to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Danielle. That was really great. There is one question in the chat box. Also, my cat has joined us. He also enjoyed the talk. There is one question in the chat box, and it said, have you looked at cities adding beet juice to road salt? And that comes from Christine Favilla. I'm sorry if I said your last name wrong. And then Amber also added to that, saying that she knows some municipalities in St. Louis use beet juice and or a brine combo, and she worries about a high BOD in beets depleting dissolved oxygen.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I have not specifically looked at the use of beet juice, but it's something that I have heard about several times, and I completely agree with Amber that basically what happens with beet juice is while salt is toxic to invertebrates, beet juice or other types of, like I've heard of people using pickle juice, things like that have sugars in them, and those sugars can increase the amount of bacteria in the stream, and when you have more bacteria, then you're going to have more, as Amber mentioned, a biological oxygen demand, which means that the bacteria are sucking up all of the oxygen, and then there's not enough for all of the other animals. So yeah, I'm not sure. It is possible that I've heard that you can use like some salt and some beet juice, and perhaps using both but less of each might end up being of net benefit, but I haven't studied that, and I haven't read anywhere else that anyone else has. So I hope that answers your question.
Next, April asks, is the 40 milligram per liter also what we should have for lake chloride?
That's probably, at least historically, where a lot of them would have been. It depends a lot about the lake. You know, obviously there's, you know, the Great Salt Lake. That's not for people using road salt. So it depends on how much of a closed system, you know, if most of the water lost from the lake comes from evaporation, then the concentration is going to be higher. But if the lake has an outlet or an overflow of some kind, then it should be, you know, closer to that range.
Okay, and then another question comes from Zach, and it says, sorry I missed the beginning, but are homeowners encouraged to use a saltwater brine in place of salt for sidewalks, or is that primarily for municipalities to use on streets?
Yes, that's something that, yeah, I had that kind of in the middle of the presentation and as a kind of a teaser, but I didn't actually get to you know, elaborate on that. So I'm glad that Zach mentioned that. So again, I haven't seen any studies or anything about using it residentially as a homeowner. But if you're planning to use salt on your sidewalk or driveway, then it can be more effective, I think, to use a brine. If you happen to have a saltwater fish tank, you can use that to kind of make sure you're getting the right amount of salt. Again, it's supposed to be a 23% salt solution. I'm not exactly sure how that translates. But there's a fellow graduate student at St. Louis University was actually giving that a shot, and she said it worked really well on her sidewalk, where she just got like a little spray bottle and sprayed it on I think she sprayed it on her steps because they get kind of icy. So if you need to use salt, then maybe give it a try. Maybe you can report back to everyone else then.
Patricia asks, is there any documentation of invertebrates present in fresh water pre-1940, and in parentheses, and salt use?
Okay, so yeah, the salt use, like I mentioned, began kind of in 1940. You know, a lot more people were using it starting in, I think, the 60s before it really became more commonplace. I'm sure there are records of invertebrates, but I don't think that the collection methods were as widely used or necessarily as standardized at the time. you know, a lot of people at that time were more interested in like just collecting to find out what existed in a location rather than documenting, you know, rather than documenting specific community compositions and things like that. But that would be something interesting to look more into. There's probably several places where a comparison could be made for before and after salt use.
And Zach responded saying, thank you. He lives in a very busy walkway in Chicago and they're trying to use less or no salt, but they need to de-ice somehow.
Yeah, yeah. Best you can do in some cases is shoveling, or you know, if you have to use something, then trying, like I'm not sure how well it would work in your situation, but a lot of times using sand is a good option. You wouldn't want to use sand widely on the roads because that, again, anything we put on the roads is going to end up in the streams. But if you're putting it, for example, on your sidewalk, probably most of the sand will get washed into a nearby lawn as opposed to, or other planted area, rather than washing into the street. So if that's an option as well, that's something to think about, or maybe spraying a brine on a small amount of sand. That might also be an option.
Does anybody else have any questions? I have a question.
Okay.
Do the sites that have the high chloride in the winter also show lower stream qualities in the summer?
Not necessarily, at least not on, as far as their salt level. And actually there is a pretty interesting story about the site that had the concentration that's higher than what you find in the ocean. That location, for those who are familiar with the St. Louis area, that sample was taken from the River des Peres. Many people in St. Louis area know the River des Peres as that crummy, channelized box culvert, basically, that makes the border between St. Louis City and St. Louis County. But that's not the part of River des Peres that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a very beautiful, intact looking stream, beautiful for as far as you get for an urban stream, at least. You know, doesn't have major erosion problems or anything like that, so it still looks pretty good. But I got those numbers and started wondering what was going on there. And that was kind of in the same time frame as it was a very cold January, and it was very dry, but it was cold, and so there was a lot of water main breaks that occurred in that time period. And so I reached out to Missouri American Water to find out, you know, was there a water main break in that area, and maybe they had to put a lot of salt down for traffic safety because it was, you know, all of this water was spilling out into the roadways and then freezing. But they said no, they didn't have a water main break anywhere in that area at the time frame I was looking at. So as a kind of a last ditch effort, I was like, let's see what's on Google if it shows anything interesting. And it did, actually. There was a picture that was taken within 1 week of when that measurement was, and about a half a mile upstream, you could see that there was an uncovered salt pile, and you could even see the pathway of that dissolved salt heading into the stream. So, you know, it definitely wasn't broken equipment or anything. It was just a really bad, basically the equivalent of a salt spill. So, but yeah, and it was a relatively short exposure. I'm sure it didn't help the animals in the stream, but, you know, that it's a location that has several other potential water quality issues as well. So can't really say for sure what caused it.
Does having a stream with higher chloride levels, does that make it less likely to freeze over in the winter?
Possibly. There's a lot of factors that go into when water will freeze, and one of those is how much it's moving. So the more the water is moving, the longer it will take to freeze over. You know, that's why they have like fountains in some of those lakes to try to keep them from freezing so they can stay aerated. But I mean, it probably does lower lower the freezing point at least some. If it's a lot of salt, if it's up in the thousands. If it's just, in the hundreds, probably not noticeable to you and I.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Okay. Oh. Rhonda asks, would increasing grass buffer strips along the roadsides help reduce the salt runoff?
So there's kind of two ways to answer that. One is that it doesn't really decrease, like the salt is there if it's put on the pavement, and it's going to run off and go somewhere. So when it runs off, if it goes into a grass buffer strip rather than into a concrete storm drain where it's just sent directly to the stream, it will slow down the movement of the chloride. So that will just kind of like it slows down the flow in general. So instead of having really high peaks of chloride, it would spread it out over time. There is evidence that a lot of salt is being retained in roadside areas. And so we're having this buildup of salt either connected with the soil or just hanging out in the groundwater and then moving slowly over the course of the year into the stream. So like I've mentioned, that stream typically had, the concentrations were 60 to 80. Sometimes it would be 200, just depending on circumstances. And some of that, if it's high in the summer, it could just be residual salt that had been held in a buffer strip or other groundwater type reservoir before it goes into the streams following some random storm. So it's still there. The best solution to the chloride problem is to use less salt in whatever way that can be done. My personal favorite is, and I forgot to mention it as an individual choice, is just stay home. It's like, it snowed, don't go outside. Now, in some places that's less of an option. In St. Louis, if it snows, give it a good 12 hours and it's probably going to be clear. So, that might be an option for some of us. I'm sure it's not for a lot of us, though.
All right, well, thank you, Danielle. Unless anybody else has any questions, feel free to come on or put them in the chat. But thank you for the presentation. It's very good.
Thank you.
Informative.
All right, thank you. And again, thanks to everyone for coming. And I think you may have seen earlier on the kind of the rotating slides that we're going to have a winter speaker series too. So keep an eye out for that.